Starting in Luke chapter 6, we're going to be starting in verse 6. Just before I read that, I think back to when I started going to church as I was 3 or 4, and actually I was sent to church. I wasn't taken to church. Mom and Dad weren't believers when we children started to attend church, and it really was through the Vacation Bible School. I'm not actually sure we went to church until the pastor came and visited, and Mom and Dad received Christ, and then they took us to church. But at that time, women still wore gloves and hats, and men didn't even not wear a sports coat. They wore a sports coat, but they also wore a tie. So pretty much you went to church and you wore a suit and tie, and that's the nature of the beast. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that at our next board meeting, I'm going to suggest, and the board is going to listen to me, that from now on, all the women have to wear hats and gloves and dresses to church.
That sounds good.
And all the men have to wear suits and ties. Yes. Even when it gets to be 100 degrees on Parkhill Road, that's the new mandate. And so everybody agrees with Pastor Wayne, and it's a fantastic idea. Everybody's in agreement, so we start coming to church, and lo and behold, somebody who didn't get the memo shows up, and either the gal doesn't have a hat or the guy doesn't have a tie. Boy, oh boy, oh boy, are they in trouble. Probably we will not even let them through the church doors because they're not wearing a hat and gloves, or they're not wearing a suit and a tie. Now, obviously, you know that, number one, I wouldn't say that, but number two, even if I did, nobody would go along with it. And even if they did, the rest of you who weren't on the board wouldn't go along with it. So, I mean, it's kind of like, it's a kind of a stupid thing to say in the first place, and it accomplished nothing. So why did you even do it? Well, as I told you last week when we discussed that Jesus was the Lord of the Sabbath, we found that Jesus, the boys were going along picking wheat and eating it, and the Pharisees got really, really angry because they were working. Well, if you want to say that that was a problem, then today's message, there's even a bigger problem. And it isn't a small thing. The sermon title would be an example of Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath. A subpoint would be good is done. And you're going to say, well, that's like a no-brainer. Well, believe me, there's a lot of no-brainer stuff in this. So what does Luke do? Well, the first thing, as you know, he sets up the story in verse 6 with, and it came about on another Sabbath, that he entered the synagogue and was teaching. So that's the setup for the story. So what's so great about it? Well, in a sense, what Luke is doing is saying, I got another story for you. It's another Sabbath. It's another synagogue. It's another time when Jesus is teaching. So, any earth-shattering information there so far? No, and that's the point. This is just a continuation of a series of things that Luke is laying out in order for us to begin to follow closely in the footsteps of our Master. Now, I need to stop even here and remind us, or ask you, it's a reminder to me, but I'm asking you, are you settled on who Jesus is? Because if he's still just that good, I'll say it disrespectfully, dude who heals people and does miracles and says nice things and has a good philosophy on life, then you have him somewhere way, 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 way down from where he really is. We covered a lot of this with the Christmas story and the miraculous conception and the miraculous birth and the miraculous survival, and then the miraculous attestations by the shepherds, well, the angels, the shepherds, Simeon, Anna, all these things coming up to Joseph and Mary and saying, wow, he's the one. And then going through, even what, a month ago, covering where Jesus forgave sins. Jesus forgave sins.
Amen.
I mean, it's crazy. Jesus forgave sins. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So at this point, for you and I, already and way earlier, because we're about a year in advance of the resurrection is all by itself. I mean, if you question, death, burial, by the time you get to the resurrection, if you're still in doubt, then you're going to be in doubt until eternity. But you don't need to be in doubt even up to this point. By this point, we should be settled on who Jesus is. So Luke now is upping, to use a phrase in Las Vegas terms, upping the ante. And it came about on another Sabbath that he entered the synagogue and was teaching. Okay, so the setting is set. Now Luke adds something here because there's going to be a player in this. The subject is the second part of verse 6. And there was there a man whose right hand was withered. So we have the holy man, Jesus, on the holy day, the Sabbath, in a holy place, the synagogue, in a situation, obviously, that Luke is telling us there's going to be some impact here. Well, what's going to facilitate that impact? A man with a withered hand. Not just any hand, his right hand. Now, if you've missed this somewhere in your past years of life, in the East, the right hand is the noble hand. The left hand is the ignoble hand. For all practical purposes, this is the clean hand and this is the dirty hand. So we've already got two things going on here. One, the hand is withered, and it has been. It wasn't like something happened and the hand atrophied into a 100% useless appendage. But it's the noble hand. So in a sense, everything this guy does is dirty, which is kind of a sad comment on his life. But what do we notice about him? He's in synagogue. His heart is fine. His hand isn't, but his heart is. So that's what we know from verse 6. The holy man on a holy day in the holy place, and there's a needy man there. Now verse 7 tips the hand of these people, and the words there are just amazing to me. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath in order that they might find reason to accuse him. I think in terms sometimes of how to make this work here for the church, and I think, how many of you showed up this morning to see if Wayne's going to trip up? To see if he's going to call Rusty Rocky? Oh, he did it! Let's fire him! I want you to see in verse 7, they were watching, and the word means to watch insidiously. So it's not like when we watch our grandkids, we're watching for their bad behavior. Oh, I sure hope Titus is really bad to Levi. Oh yeah, gotta watch him. No, we watch him because we love him. These guys' intent to show up at synagogue was to watch Jesus to see what he would do, especially in this case where it says to see if he would heal. Whoa, what a horrible thing terrible, terrible thing. I'm going to go to the hospital and pray for this person. It happens to be Sunday, but I'm going to pray for him and see if God will have the fever leave. Oh, it did. Oh, that's evil. Okay. But they were watching him insidiously and closely. I like the whole concept. Well, I don't like it, but I mean, I like better the concept of explanation with insidiously rather than closely. The intent of them watching closely was insidious. In order that they might discover, they might find out, they might discover something by which to accuse him. Whoa! I'll be honest with you. If every Sunday I showed up at church and I knew that's what you were all doing, well, let's just say you'd be looking for a new pastor in about... I mean, how can you live under that? So we find Jesus being who he is. Verse 8. Jesus, he knew. And that's the way Luke writes it. He actually writes it, there's more than once in here where he says the statement, and then it's he again. And you can see that I translated that, he himself knew. And it's difficult to translate it into English where it's doubled up. So he knew. Jesus knew. What did he know? He knew their reasonings. The word is dialogue. It transliterates into dialogus, so dialogue. But it's translated reasonings. But one of the words that describes it is to deliberate. And I mean, reasonings is fine. Don't throw it out. But I like the concept of deliberation. Because to reason kind of sounds like, hey, what do you think of? Oh, I think it's great. I mean, reasoning. But to deliberate kind of has a little bit more, okay, if this, then this. If that, then that. And I just see it, again, a little more insidiously. So there is nothing good going on here. So we find in verse 8, but he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward, and he got up and came forward. So you see the progression here. Jesus knew what they were thinking. And so the subject here, which obviously Luke has already told us in verse 6, the man with the withered hand is going to be the subject. He's going to be the illustration. The word there is in green, which means that he said, get up. I should not sing yet. I sing so much and then I use my voice. Sorry. Get up or rise up and stand in the midst. And in the midst is translated come forward, and it's really hard to know because the difference between in the middle is right there. In the midst is anywhere in the room. So the point here is that Jesus has him get up from his seated position, which would be the position of the student, to here, and stand so that everybody can see you. There's nobody going to miss out on this because he's standing in the midst. Now, while he in verse 8, where Lenski has moreover, because he's trying to make the point that this is happening. Jesus knew their reasoning, so he's going to do two things. He's going to address the man with the withered hand, and then in verse 9, he's going to address the people in the audience, whom we already know are insidiously watching him for insidious ends. So he says, I inquire of you whether it is lawful on the Sabbath to do a good deed or to do a base deed, to save a life or to destroy it. So the word I ask is more than, for example, where is the salt and pepper? That's a rather innocuous question. An inquiry would be, what did you do with the salt and pepper? In other words, there's more of an inquiry, there's more of an investigative concept involved in this word. It's not a simple, please pass the salt and pepper. It's a question of investigation. So he is forcing now his position as the teacher into their lives. He's asking them a question that they have to answer, and it's not an innocuous thing. So he says, and he uses the same word which we had last week, is it lawful? Is it permissible? Is it okay on the Sabbath to do a good thing or to do a bad thing? Now, Matthew gives us a little bit of the account. Matthew adds a little bit more, and he says, which of you, having a sheep that falls into a hole, will not, on the Sabbath, reach in and pick him up and take the sheep out? And of course, not a single person in the room would say, oh, I wouldn't do it. I'd leave it in there, and if it was still alive in the morning from the coyotes and the wolves and the bears and other bad sheep who hated him, I'd come and get them on Sunday morning then instead of Sabbath. Nobody would do that. So the point is well made on is it okay, is it permissible to do a good thing? And a good thing is, both the good thing and the bad thing are one word. Good thing is the word moral excellence, good, to accomplish. And the bad thing is the evil thing, the morally based thing, to do, to accomplish. So is it permissible on the Sabbath to do a morally excellent thing? Or is it permissible on the Sabbath to do an evil thing? Now, you can take that further, and I don't know actually how far to take it, because if you know a good thing to do and do not do it, is that not in and of itself an evil thing? So you have the opportunity to help somebody, and you look on it, well, it's Sunday, so I can't do it. Or it's the Sabbath, so I can't do it. But I'll come back tomorrow if they still have a need, and we'll take care of business there. Haven't you just crossed a line? Now, Jesus, again, to use the same phrase I did before, he ups the ante a second time. He doesn't just ask the... By the way, if I asked my grandkids, so 5, 8, and 10, okay, boys, on any given day, which is best to do, a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, Jesus is asking a question that anybody could answer. Logically. I mean, not even spiritually, just logically. Anybody can answer. So he begins with that, but he doesn't stop. As I said, he's going to up the ante. To save a life or to destroy it. We have just exponentially jumped. To do a good thing, to save a life, to do a bad thing, to destroy a life. Do you realize that to destroy a life on any day, is a terrible thing? It just is. Why do you think so many of our veterans come home and they have issues with living? It's because they've had to destroy things. And when I say things, I'm not talking about bridges. Nobody has a good time destroying life on any day of the week. So Jesus is you go literally to the extreme here. Is it permissible to save a life or to destroy it on the Sabbath? Again, any logical, sane person would say a good thing and to save a life. Yes, permissible on any day of the week, including the Sabbath. But are we talking about people who have not set aside what we would term logic in order to accomplish hatred? So, he asked this question. Verse 10, you and I get to enter into the room, and you can place yourself up here right now and stand out and look at the audience. And Jesus' eyes went to every single person in the audience. And I'm going to say this is the difference, there's many, between me and Jesus. I can look at you, but Jesus can look in you. So you can imagine right now Jesus up here looking in you. He knows what you're thinking. He knows you hate him. Verse 10, and looking around at all of them, he said, stretch out your hand. Stop and think about that. Did Jesus say, hand be healed? Did he go up and take his hand and heal it? Did Jesus do anything? Stretch out your hand. Well, the hand is still there, whether it's withered or whole, right? Stretching out your hand. If that's all the guy had done, and he said, okay, put it down, and the hand was still withered, would there have been any difference? Because Jesus, all he said was stretch out your hand. This is, again, sometimes in the scriptures when powerful things happen, they're so succinct you almost missed them. And his hand, and he did, so the man did what Jesus said, and his hand was completely restored. I think it's Mark or Matthew, because I read them both, and there's a lot of information in both. But one of them says, and the hand was restored just like the other. So he had two useful hands. So I go back and I ask you, what did Jesus do? He said, stretch out your hand. What had he already done? Get up and stand in the midst. Okay, so was that a work? Yeah, I mean, do you see the lack of logic here? The lack of any sort of coherent thought? So he went to the ultimate extreme, which isn't an extreme at all. Stretch out your hand. And every person over here, and every person over here, and those in front and those behind, every one of them could see a brand new hand. All right. The scriptures tell us that the people were so joyful, they got up, there was a big party, they killed the fattened calf, they partied for weeks and months and years, and Jesus was 99 years old when the party ended. Okay, that's not what it says. Yeah, that's in verse 9,642. All right, in verse 11, and they were filled with madness. I'm going to say allergies. Who knows? Only God knows. The New American Standard says they were filled with rage. The Lenski and the King James both say that they were filled with madness. And the word they were filled. They were filled. The word is without thinking. It's the word mind or thought with an A in front, and the A always means without, like atheist, without God. So it's without mind. They were completely filled with mindlessness, madness. There's a quote here: the more sensibly, rationally, lucidly Jesus spoke, the more crazy these fools became. This is one of the mysteries in the human heart and will, that the truth, goodness, and salvation of Christ have the very opposite effect in some hearts from what they ought to have. So, what we find here in verse 11, they were filled with madness, they were filled with rage, and discussed together, I think it's Matthew that says they went out and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. I am a little bit confused by Luke, who only says what they might do to Jesus. I think it's, again, Matthew or Mark, because I can't remember because they both give information, said they went to the Herodians. So outside, they left the synagogue, they went outside with the Herodians, and the other two tell us that they went out with the intent to destroy him. The same word Jesus had just asked, which is permissible on a Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it. And now both Matthew and Mark tell us they went out with the intent of finding out how they could destroy him.
That's what's going on right now. Trump has done good. Other people hate him because they are losing everything.
Yeah, I am aware of that.
Very much so.
And believe me, I bit my tongue on all of this, Paul. There's so much going on that I could have alluded to, and I chose not to because you guys can turn on the news or read the internet or watch the pictures or make your own decisions. And it's the same thing as here. In fact, that leads up to the conclusion. Okay. The conclusion in this, is there a case to accuse Jesus? No. Stretch out your hand. How is that any different than stand up or get up and stand in the midst? He did not do any work. Jesus did not do any work. He definitely facilitated that man's hand becoming whole. I mean, there's no question there. I'm pretty certain that something in the power of Jesus' own declaration, stretch out your hand, facilitated that. So I'm going to give him the glory. But was that a work? Well, you couldn't prove it. You could say what you saw, but you couldn't prove it because he didn't say be healed. It just happened. Is there a case in which the law was broken? Well, no. Good was accomplished and a life was changed. Believe me, that guy went home and now he can use the clean, the righteous hand for everything instead of the unrighteous hand. Yeah, believe me, that guy's life has changed forever. Is there a reason for the lack of reason? Not a good one. There is no good reason for the lack of reason. But yes, there is a reason. Let me tell you what that reason is. And for those of you who were in Bible study, apparently I left. Nope, I got it right here. In Bible study about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we did Psalm 2. And in Psalm 2, there was this question at the beginning of the psalm, and then it answers itself. Why do the heathen or the nations rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Well, his anointed is Jesus. It is the Christ. It's an Old Testament look forward. And this is what the nations say. Let us break their bonds asunder. That is God and the anointed, Jesus. And cast away their cords from us. God and his anointed, Jesus. The world rages against God. The world rages against good. We already know that in the they will call good evil and evil good. We already know that. And we can see it day after day when something good is called evil and something evil is called good. This is what, if you remember Romans chapter 1, is a fantastic chapter, but there's a lot of ugliness in it in the second part. I'm only picking 2 verses out of Romans chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. You see, what's happening today happened with Jesus. And what happened with Jesus is happening today. These people who sat under the direction of Jesus, and I don't think this was the first event of the day. I think that Jesus had been teaching, and again, if you can only imagine how Jesus would teach. I mean, I'm like so far down on the list of shepherds under the great shepherd, and you know what happens when the word of God stirs your heart. And I'm not Jesus. They heard Jesus. They rejected him. They rejected ultimately what we would call the law and the intent of the law. They were asking questions that God didn't intend them to ask. God gave the directions and they kept adding to it. Well, what can't we do? What can't we do? Wrong question. It's what can we do? And we can glorify God. Stretch out your hand, buddy. Be healed. Stand up. Be cast out. But what did they do? They would have saved a sheep, but they could give a rip about the man. And ultimately, therefore, what they were doing is they were elevating their own thoughts above God's thoughts. They were elevating their own hearts above God's heart. I mean, we could go all the way to the throne of heaven, and we could be sitting up as our own little Supreme Court here, God, us, and this situation. God, really, what is your heart regarding this withered man? Should Jesus have healed it on the Sabbath? Really? Seriously? Should he have healed that guy? And God would say, why are you guys here? Of course he should have healed it. Duh! See, I'm not a very good God, am I? So, we have this. We see what's happening today, and wherever your views are, I would encourage you to go and sift them through what God would say. Because you can ask Kathy and I our opinion. It's 99.999% the same. What do we disagree on? But is that the final issue? We need to be filtering our responses to our world via what God would want, what God would say. And these guys with Jesus refused. They refused. They had to have refused. The word is without thinking. They responded without thought. They were filled with rage to the point where on the very day they were accusing Jesus of doing good, they themselves were seeking how to destroy. That goes in opposite directions. So this is how the conclusion goes. What you think about Jesus matters. You've got to get it right, 100%. Make sure in your own heart you have looked at Jesus and said, he indeed is the only way God has provided for me to have my transgressions against the living, holy Creator God forgiven, taken away, removed, cast as far as the east is from the west into the deepest part of the ocean, and God has put up a no fishing sign above that. Jesus is either that, or why in the world are we here? It's either all about him, or it's all about whatever I want to tell you. Ladies, next week, hat and gloves. Men, suits and ties. There, the dictate is given. So, get it right with Jesus. It's so simple. I mean, Titus is 5 years old. I want to know God. How do you know him? Through Jesus Christ. I want to accept him. Wow. And it is done. Father, we are so grateful that we can gather and recognize that we can gather on any day, but we do gather on this day, kind of more or less established as the Lord's Day, and a day for us to reflect upon you, to enjoy the body, the connection between one another. We are so grateful for what you provided for us, not just at this Parkhill Community Church, but for every church around the world that can gather, or even by distance, by Zoom, or by even just by letter, however people have to these days, or get to, that you have made provision for us to connect with the head of the body, and that the body gets to reflect the head to the world. May we do a good job, Father. May we not minor on major things, and may we not major on minor things. May we major on you, and then find out how to make that work to the best possible way by keeping our hearts connected with you. So, we commit our way to you, Father. There's much to accomplish for heaven, much to accomplish for Christ's sake. There's much you want to accomplish in each of us. May we be willing to have that happen. We commit our way to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.